I've got another problem that I would like for us to look at for just a few minutes that is an application of the economic order quantity formula that we were using yesterday. It's a very simple approach, but I think it will help you to cement that idea into your thinking. And so this is an inventory management program that is looking at a bakery. This bakery orders 100 50-kilogram sacks of flour every 3 months. And so what I would like for us to talk about for a moment is, what is the average inventory of flour in the storeroom? That's where the flour is kept, and when he needs flour, he goes to the storeroom and gets it. What is the average inventory? Let's assume that the baker has immediate restocking of the product. So when he runs out, places an order, and this afternoon another 100 bags of flour come. Okay? So we're going to assume then that the order is placed when the inventory level is at 0. Okay? So what I would like to know, over the 3 months, what is the average inventory that this baker is experiencing? He orders 100, and so over the 3 months, so on a random day, the average inventory is going to be, well, it's not on a given day. We're going to average it on the basis of that 3 months. Okay? How do we calculate the average?
How much we use one day or 30 days?
Yeah. Well, this is 190 days. Yeah. The way we calculate an average is take the beginning and the end, add them together, and divide by 2. Okay? So on the average, the formula that we would use for calculating the average inventory is going to be Q, that is the amount that we ordered, 100, divided by 2. 100 divided by 2 is 50. So 50 is our average inventory for that first quarter of operation. Okay? Now the second is, what is the average inventory of flour in the next cycle, quarter 2? We got down to 0 at the end of the first quarter. We order 100, and at the end of the second we get 0. So the average inventory in the second quarter is? Is what?
The same.
The same, exactly. What about the third quarter?
The same.
The same. What about the fourth quarter? The same. What about the year? What is the inventory at the beginning of the year? 100. What's the inventory at the end of the year? 0. What's the average inventory? 50. Another way that we could do that, we take the average inventory of first quarter plus second quarter plus third quarter plus fourth quarter, divide by 4 quarters, 50. 200 divided by 4 is 50. An important principle in terms of the economic order quantity is that our average inventory is independent of time. It doesn't matter. We could look at the inventory that we have today at the beginning, and we could look at it at the end of the day and find the average inventory. And we're going to look at that over a month or a quarter, and as a result of that, we would find that the average inventory is going to be 50. It's always going to be the same. It's not going to vary at all. And so as a result of that, we are going to know what our average inventory is at any day of the year. Last question on the set is, what is the average inventory in kilograms? Okay, now we're going to apply the economic order quantity. This same local bakery makes donuts. You might think that I have a fixation on donuts, but I really don't. The baker uses 50 bags of mix every 3 months. The cost of ordering is $12 per order. The carrying charges that we discussed yesterday is 22% of the cost of the flour, and the cost of the flour is $27 per bag. Okay? The mix, when ordered in the morning, is delivered that afternoon. What I would like for us to do is to develop an operating doctrine that is a rule that's going to tell us when are we going to order and how much are we going to order in order to minimize cost. Before we approach this problem any further, I want to look at some of the characteristics of this bakery. Very few products, very few items that are ordered. In institutional food service, we order thousands of items on a regular basis. So here we have very few, and they are ordered very irregularly. A long time between order. But we're interested in seeing if there's some way in which we can reduce cost. So let's apply the information that we have into the formula that we were looking at yesterday. And the formula, if you remember, is the square root of 2 times what? The annual usage. Okay? What is annual usage in this case? 50 bags per every 3 months.
50 or 4. 250 bags.
50 times 4? Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
No, 50 times 4.
Yeah, 50 times 4. So that's going to be 200 bags. Okay? And so that is the annual usage. All right? And then we multiply that by what? The cost of placing one order, which is $12. Okay? So we have 2 times 200 times 12. Okay? And then we're going to multiply that all out, and then we're going to divide it by 22% of the $27. That's the carrying cost. Okay? We'll find the square root of that, and that is going to give us the optimum number of bags to order at a time. I conveniently left my computer in my room, my calculator, actually my phone. Does someone have a calculator that will calculate square root? I do. I have it. Two times 200 times 12 equals, and we're going to divide that by 0.22 times 27, and so that equals 29.9, and then we're going to find the square root of that. Did I do that right? The ordering doctrine of the baker was to order huge quantities at one time, 100 bags or 50 bags in this case. Our economic order quantity is telling us that we only need to order 5.4707. So you're going to call up your vendor and say, I would like 5.47 bags of flour? No. I don't think so. You could do 5 or you could do 6. But that's the ballpark that we're in as far as what the economic order quantity is. Now, we use 50 bags every 3 months. Yes? How long is 6 bags going to last us? It's going to be considerably shorter. And so we're going to have inventory coming in more frequently than once a quarter, but we're going to see that we have fresher product. It's not going to be 3 months old, which is enough time for some of the fats to begin to become rancid. And so the quality is not going to be the same. Are there any questions on that? Is that fairly straightforward? We're not going to get any more difficult than that. Okay. The last question, which is an application of this, is what should the operating doctrine be regarding the quantity to order and when the order should be placed? That is the operating doctrine that is most of concern here. The operating doctrine regarding ordering is, when are we going to place the order? When inventory is 0, okay? Because we can get an immediate restocking. So there's no need to have to rotate the inventory, so we just bring in the new because everything is gone. And the quantity to order is the 5.5 or 6 bags of flour that we would get at a time, or of the donut mix. Okay? So this is not something that we're going to use for every little item that we purchase, but we're going to use it for something that we use more infrequently and in our bakery system. Okay. That cannot be. It cannot be after 4 o'clock already. Yeah. Let's begin a discussion now in the next chapter of the textbook. I think this is chapter 6, which is on food production. And this is one that I had left out of the original topic list that we would talk about. But I should not have done that, because this is probably one of the most important chapters in the whole textbook. Can you see that better than you saw it yesterday? Does it help? Or was it all right yesterday?
It was all right yesterday.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I bolded it so that I can see it. Oh, okay.
Yes, that was better.
Yeah. Good. So the global understanding that we use to begin each module is that the production of menu items in the needed quantity with the desired quality at the appropriate price is a primary goal of most food service operations. That's what we're here to do, is to provide food menu items for our customers. The second is that the use of standardized recipes will ensure a quality product and the correct quantity. And finally, portion control is essential for cost control. Now, yesterday we were dealing in the transformation subsystem, going back to where we were the first day in terms of our systems model. And so in the transformation or the process subsystem of the model, there was a section called functional subsystems. And so the functional subsystems involved procurement, and then production, and then sanitation, and then service and distribution in some order. But anyway, so today we're going to continue in this same structure, and we're going to spend a few more days in these functional subsystems, because today we're going to deal with food production. Production, when we talk about it in today's environment, we're not just talking about cooking. There's a lot more to it than just the preparation of the food. It involves planning and controlling ingredients. So when we talk about procurement and all that we have done in that, we're really talking about the preparation for production. We're also talking about production methods. We talked about that, I think, on Tuesday. Conventional production versus ready food system versus assembly serve. But we're also concerned about labor productivity. What can we do to maximize the productivity of our employees? And we're also concerned about energy management. Is energy inexpensive? Is it without limit? Can you use as much water as you want? As much natural gas as you want? You're going to pay a very expensive price for it. And so we really do need to control these costs, but we need to obtain our objectives as well. So in production, there are two basic decisions that have to be made. And do you remember what we talked about in July when I was here? We talked about forecasting and production demand and that kind of thing. So I'm not spending a lot of time on that. You can go back and look at those notes, but I want to give enough material so that there are no gaps in our understanding. So two basic decisions that a manager needs to make regarding production, and that is, number one, what is the rate of production? How many meals are we going to serve today? Tomorrow, next week. So we need to look forward in a forecasting mechanism to tell us what that volume is going to be. Then the second decision that needs to be made is, once that we know what our volume is going to be, how many employees do we need to produce those meals? That is where we've got to spend some time as well. And so each decision that we make of these two has very definite cost implications for the system. And I think that we need to understand what those costs are and to deal with them. And so when we talk about the rate of production, are we ever going to be exactly where we need to be? So if we are forecasting 260 customers for our meals next Tuesday. It's 260. Okay? Are we in our forecast going to really hit that right on the 260 mark? Or is it going to be less, or is it going to be more? Yes, it's going to be more or less. Very seldom, it's almost an accident if your forecast does hit exactly where it needs to be. If we're within 5% of our forecast, if it's 5%, either above or below, that's probably not a bad range to be in. There are other forecast methods that are even worse than that. There are not very many forecast methods that are better then plus or minus 5%. So if we have a situation where we have underproduced, what are the cost consequences of that? We have not produced enough food. One of the consequences is, I'm sorry, we've run out of food. Come back tomorrow. Is that going to go well with your customer? I don't think so. I think as dietitians, we have it built into our decision that we are going to provide food no matter what. We don't want to see people go hungry. And so, what are the costs of underproduction? Unhappy customers. I didn't get what I wanted. We talked about that a little bit on Monday, I think, in terms of going to the restaurant and the item that you wanted was not the same, or, sorry, we're out. So you're going to have customers that are very dissatisfied. You're going to have customers that maybe will think twice next time before they come and purchase food from you. And so we've got to do something to help them get the nutrition that they need. So one of the alternatives that we have is to use additional food that we may have in the storeroom that we can hurriedly prepare so that we have a replacement for the item that we have run out of. And later, as we talk about production planning, I think that we need to really look at some options as we plan not only the menu but our production so that we have in mind what we would substitute in the event that we run out. I think that's helpful. Now, a personal feeling that I have about underproduction is that if I am disadvantaging a customer, that is, I have frankly run out of food and I know that I've got to provide food for the customer, but what am I going to provide? I believe that I should provide a menu item that is going to be better than what was original. So in terms of helping that customer to feel better, I've given them something better than what they would have originally gotten. And by doing that, what I'm trying to do is to keep that customer in my favor so that they will come again. Maybe even one of the things that I would do would be to not charge for that. Would you feel comfortable with that? Has that ever happened to you? Would it ever happen in Romania? It doesn't happen in the U.S. very much either, but it does sometimes. It happened to me one time. I was in graduate school. My wife and family were at home, and I was in the central part of the U.S. And I didn't like to cook that night, and so I ordered a pizza. So I telephoned the pizza, and they said it'll be ready in 20 minutes, and so I went down to pick it up. No delivery, just pick it up. I told them that I was there to pick it up. They said, be ready in a minute. I stood there for about 20 minutes. No pizza. The manager came and said, we've really messed up your order. We're having to start over again. So I had to wait another 20 minutes. So I've got the original 20 minutes plus another 20 minutes plus another 20 minutes. An hour. And I wasn't getting any hungry. I was still hungry. I was getting hungrier by the minute. If you were the manager, what would you do in that situation? It was a free pizza. Indeed, it was. That's why I tell you the story. Because if I had to pay the original price of that pizza, I would not have been a happy customer. So it's universal, I think. So as a result of that, I'm happy with that company. And they still are in existence today, and that was 30 years ago. That was a long time. And so for a pizza company to be in business for that long, I think it was pretty good. So that is some of the cost consequences of underproduction. And cost consequences of overproduction. What would you think? More leftovers, exactly right. So you've got to spend time, cook's time, in taking care of those. Covering them, dating them, putting them in the refrigerator, finding some way in which to use them at another meal so that it's not food just wasted. So that is a very important thing. But again, customer, we've got to consider the customer and quality. What is the perception of the customer when they see, oh, we had this item yesterday? Are they going to feel good about you? Probably not. So that is a cost consequence that we've got to factor in as well. May we go back to the first one in terms of underproduction just a moment. Another factor that we've got to look at is the cost of the cooks, again, and this is what brought back to my thinking, is that when we run out of food, the cooks are really geared at this point to cleaning up and getting out of there as quickly as possible. But now they've got to stop what they're doing, they've got to make this additional food, and so it puts them behind as far as being ready at the end of the shift, and so you may end up paying overtime as well. So you have unhappy cooks and you have overtime to pay as well. If you had to choose between overproducing and underproducing, which would you choose? Overproducing. I agree. Some research that I did, I found through interviews and cost analysis that the cost of underproduction was about 3 times greater than the cost of overproduction. So I really tend to err on the part of overproduction. I think that's good. So we've talked about the cost consequences. It's 4:20. Let's take a break, okay? In the last hour, we were talking about the production decisions that needed to be made. One is our production rate, the other is our staffing needs. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how we can actually do this. And again, we spent some time in July doing this, but for a review, let's take a look at what is involved. There are several approaches that can be taken in forecasting. The one method that I'm going to talk about, I just mentioned, I think, in brief in July, but I'm going to go over about the same material one more time because I think that this method of forecasting is the easiest. It looks difficult, but it is easy. There are several approaches that we can take, and we'll review those after we talk about exponential smoothing. All of the time series forecasting methods require a great deal of data, historical data that may go back for years. What happened years ago probably doesn't tell us very much about what is happening today. And so by looking at what has happened most recently, I feel that is going to help us then to create a forecast that is going to be as accurate as possible. So the approach to exponential smoothing is what we see in the center, that our forecast and the quantity t plus 1 means time plus 1. So today plus 1 is tomorrow. So our forecast for tomorrow is going to equal an alpha value, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, times d sub t. D stands for our demand. What was our demand today? And so that's going to be an important factor in determining our forecast for tomorrow. And then we're going to add to that 1 minus alpha with our forecast for today. So in looking at this, there are only 2 data points that we need. What was today's forecast? What was today's demand? That's all we need. Except for the alpha value. The alpha value is constrained or lies between 0 and 1. Or we could say 0% and 100%. So if we chose an alpha value of 0, for example, the forecast for tomorrow is not going to have anything to do with today's demand because alpha is equal to 0. So 0 times any number is going to be 0. So 1 minus alpha, 1 minus 0 is still going to be 1. So our forecast for tomorrow is our forecast for today. Is that pretty straightforward? You understand what's happening here? Now, let's take the opposite situation. Alpha is equal to 0. No, that's where we were just now. Alpha is equal to 1. Okay, so our forecast for tomorrow is going to be 1 times our demand for today. And then 1 minus alpha is going to be 0, and so the forecast of today just drops out. So this is saying that our forecast for tomorrow is our demand for today. Now, this is a rational decision. There are many people who will use this as a forecasting model and say, whatever I had today, we're going to have that tomorrow. And so that is the basis of their planning. Not bad, but maybe we can improve on it. And that's what I'm trying to help us to look at. Now, alpha values can, as I indicated, go between 0 and 1. But most of the research is showing that an alpha value of about 0.3, between 0.2 and 0.3, is probably optimum. So that means that 30% of our forecast is going to be based upon today's demand, and 70% is going to be based upon today's forecast. I want to tell you another little secret. Embedded in that F sub t, the forecast for today, is information about what has happened over many preceding days, because that number will change, and it is changing in response to what has been happening with demand. So it's important that we keep that forecast figure as clean, as pure as possible, and not let it get affected by too much, in terms of too much noise, as an example. Do you know what noise is? Noise is stuff that distracts our attention. Yeah. Noise is also referred to as a random variable in a statistical point of view. So we're using the term noise as a random variable. And what we want to try to do in our forecasting methodology is to minimize all of this randomness. It's still going to be there, we just want to minimize it. And so, by keeping that forecast as accurate as possible through the succeeding days and months and years, it's going to help us. Now, the other thing that's going to help us to do in terms of keeping this as pure as possible is that what? My mind did not catch up with me. This happens every once in a while. And so where was I? That's it. Anyway, let's continue. this forecast value is going to provide the continuity that we need in the forecast model. I think that's essentially what I was going.
You can apply to a hospital because, for example, you have 100 patients, but maybe 20 patients will be extern and 40 are going in.
Mhm.
So you have a problem.
Yes, you do. And does that discharge and admittance to the hospital, does it happen on particular days or does it happen every day?
I think every day
Pretty
people
much.
come in and
I think that we would find that if we recorded the number of patients admitted and the number of patients discharged, that over time we would see that it falls within a relatively narrow range. Sometimes it may get bigger, but typically Mondays are going to be like Mondays and Tuesdays are like Tuesdays and Fridays are like Fridays, but it's not going to vary all that much. And so the concern that you have is a very valid concern. And the way in which I resolve that in my own thinking is that rather than having one exponential smoothing forecast, I have 7. 1 for each day of the week. Okay? And it really doesn't matter. It is just showing that what happened last Monday and the Monday before that is going to be probably more representative of what's going to happen this Monday because of things that are happening on a routine basis in the hospital. Now, accidents and that sort of thing, those are going to be like random variables that are occurring. And it's going to happen. Before we're done, we're going to take a look at these random variables and see really the impact that it has on our operation. Okay? Let's do a little bit of professional practice. What I want to do is to apply exponential smoothing. And we have a small restaurant, and we sell hamburgers. And these are the demand for hamburgers that we have experienced over the last 5 days. 195, 200, 185, 160, and 175. So we don't know what days of the week these are, but these are what our demands have been. We have also a forecast of what we were using for this product, 176, 186, 187. So here in the middle, we're really pretty close. But then you see on the next to the last day where we had 160, our forecast of 182 is not that much different from the 187, but our demand dropped off that day. Then our forecast for the last day is 183, and the demand was actually 175. Now, our forecast methodology here is not exponential smoothing. It was another kind of forecast, because exponential smoothing is really taking the ups and downs, the peaks and the valleys of demand, and smoothing them. It's like taking a tractor and pushing the tops of the snow into the valleys so that it's level rather than all of the peaks. Or the snow might be dirt, or it might be something else, sand. But we're trying to make it smooth rather than so jagged. And so that's why we see some days that there's a fair amount of variation between the demand and the forecast. So of all of this data, what data are we going to need to use in order to calculate our forecast for the next day?
how many people work in that day?
We're going to use
For example,
the very last line, the 175 and the 183. Of all the data, that's all we need to implement exponential smoothing. So let's look at this. So our forecast for tomorrow, t plus 1, is equal with an alpha of 0.3. 0.3 times 175 plus 1 minus 0.3, or 0.7, times 183. So that's where those two numbers are coming in. So our forecast for tomorrow is going to be the product of alpha times the demand plus 1 minus alpha times the forecast, or 52.5 plus 128.1. And so our forecast for tomorrow is 180.1. That's the precise number that we got, but it's difficult to have 0.1 of a meal, 0.1 of a person. So we round. And so 180 is going to be our forecast for tomorrow. So that's going to be the basis of our planning. At least we have a basis to plan. We're not just picking a number at random out of our mind. Let's stop for just a minute and talk about numbers coming out of our mind. In my training, one of the rotations that I had was to work with the production planner in the cafeteria, in the hospital cafeteria, and for the hospital patients. So we were dealing with well over 1,000 people that we were feeding on a daily basis for one meal, noon meal. And this individual was a fantastic person because he would take weather, he would take the day of the week, he would take the day of the month, and the menu and other factors, and come up with an estimate of the number of people that we were going to serve. He hit it right on, day after day after day. This was a military setting, and so it was probably a little bit more predictable than in a civilian kind of a setting. But soldiers in the U.S., part of their pay is the food that they eat, or that they are given. And so on payday, where do you go to eat? You have money finally, so you go off the base to eat. But as you get closer to the end of the month, you don't have as much money, and so you go to where the food is free. So that was one of the factors that he was considering. And so this approach to forecasting I would refer to as a subjective method of forecasting, just the feelings that this individual had. But as a result of it, we were able to do a fantastic job in terms of determining what our demand was going to be for all of the food items that had to be prepared. And so the alpha value that is chosen, I think, is a conservative number, in that most of the weight is placed upon the previous forecast, which is not so reactive to random variation. So this is going to act kind of like an anchor on a boat, kind of slow things down. You know, if you're out in a sea and you have an anchor, it's going to kind of hold you down, and so you're not going to go to the top of the wave and not to the bottom of the wave. It's going to be a smoother transition as you go through the waves. And so in this case as well, it's going to be a smoother transition, and the forecast will, no. So it's not so reactive to random variation. But as we increase the alpha value, that means we're putting more emphasis on current demand. Our forecast is going to experience more variability, more noise, more random variation. And so there is a problem associated with many of the forecast models, is that they do what we call chase noise. They're chasing random variation, not really that underlying demand. And that's where we really want to try to be, is what is the underlying demand that we're experiencing? Any questions about exponential smoothing? It's nothing more difficult than this. And if you use an alpha value of 0.3 or somewhere in that neighborhood, you will be quite acceptable in terms of your forecast. I think you'll be happy. Most of the people that I know in food production and who are doing a serious job at forecasting are using exponential smoothing. There are other approaches to exponential smoothing that will vary the alpha according to the amount of variability that's being experienced. That's too difficult for me, so I just do simple exponential smoothing. Okay? So other forecast methods that I was alluding to just a little while ago talk about time series. And so exponential smoothing is a time series where we're looking at numbers over time. There are other approaches that are causal. That means that we're using we're using linear regression, where we try to find a best fit of a line through all of these variations that are occurring. And in my doctoral statistics class, we had to do a project. And so I did a project in terms of forecasting food product demand over time, where I was looking at forecast, demand, weather, the quality of the menu, and some other variables that might affect whether or not a patient and or a customer would come to the cafeteria. It was an utter disaster. Did not come within 15% of what the demand actually was. It was bad. Exponential comes within about 5%. Regression comes 15% or worse. And I'm surprised that they talk about it in the book because it is generally recognized as a non-acceptable method of forecasting. But there are people that do it, and so that's fine. Then the third method is subjective. And I was talking about this planner in our cafeteria that did it from his mind. Very definitely a subjective method. I have tried to do subjective methods of forecasting and did not come out too badly. But the more experience you have in the operation, the better you are at subjective forecasting. But I would like to stop again and talk just a little bit about the subjective methods of evaluation. The approach that is generally taken is that of the Delphi technique. Have you heard of Delphi technique?
Oracle of Delphi.
Precisely, the Oracle at Delphi. What was happening there? Any ideas in ancient Greece?
Yes, they said that it also this, but also that. And after that, you have to wonder what will happen.
Okay, yes.
Prediction.
Predicting, when will a cure for cancer be found? What should we do in terms of a curriculum for nutrition and dietetics? And so what we do is we gather individuals who are expert around the country, give them this problem, they give us feedback, we consolidate that information, send it back to the same panel of experts, and so we are gradually coming to a consensus as to the answer to the question. And so this is a subjective approach to forecasting, more of social issues rather than forecast of demand. But nevertheless, it is an approach that I think has some value. I've participated on several Delphi panels where we were looking at the competencies that dietetic students needed to have in financial management, which I think is important. It's an important issue that needs to be dealt with. Before we leave forecasting altogether, before we go into determining staffing, there's one other thing that we need to talk about, and I think, and that is What we have really been talking about is forecasting customer numbers. How many customers are we going to have? How many patients are we going to have in the hospital? Does that really help us do production planning and telling us how many servings of meat that we need to have, how many servings of vegetables and all of that type of thing? It really doesn't. It just tells us what the total volume is going to be. How do we deal with that? Deal with it in the following way. We look at our menu, and we look at the way that patients are choosing alternative items that are on our menu. We really don't need to forecast items that all the patients are going to get, because if you know the number of patients, then you know the amount that you have to prepare. But if there is a choice that the patients have, what we need to do is to look at the percent of the patients that choose one versus the other alternative. And typically, the sum of those percentages will not equal 100%, because sometimes they'll choose neither of those options. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. But nevertheless, that percentage of patients that choose one item versus another tends to be very stable, in my experience anyway. And so, over a period of time, we look at this relationship between the number of servings and the number of people that we serve, calculate the percentage, and look at an average percent. If that average begins to change, then we'll change that in our forecast system. But the basic input that is used in a forecast system for production control is the total number of customers times the percentage acceptability of that individual menu item. So as a result of that, we can come up then with a very close estimate of what our demand is actually going to be. I don't know, maybe I should put this on a board so that we can look at it a little bit more carefully. What we're doing is that we are looking at a forecast, and we are looking at the percent error that we have associated with that forecast. Let's say that we have a very bad forecast model, and it is plus or minus 10%. We are applying then the number of customers that we were forecasting times the average acceptability of the product. And so, just for simpleness, let's say that we're going to have a forecast of 100 patients, and that we are going to multiply that times the percentage acceptability of ice cream versus cake for dessert, okay? And so the ice cream has an acceptability of 75%. And the cake has an acceptability of 65%. So if we have 100 and we have 75%, 75 portions of ice cream are going to be needed, and 65 portions of cake are going to be needed. But remember, our original forecast, this 100, is off by 10%. And so rather than 100, it's going to be 90. So 90 times 75% is going to be 90%, 63, let's say 63. Is that right? 45, 63, 67. It's going to be about 68. So if my estimates are right. So we are off 13 servings. But that can't be right. That cannot be right. 0.9 times 75. Can someone help me determine that number? That's critical to our discussion. Pardon? 80? 64. No. 64? Well, 10% of 75 is going to be 7.5. So I think it's going to be closer to 68. Anyway, we'll use 64. So we have 13, an error of 13. Is an error of 13 going to make or break us in terms of ice cream? And likewise, in terms of the cake, if we no longer have 100, but we have 110, for example, and we have 65%, that is going to be 65 plus 6.5 is going to be 71 point. So it's going to be, rather than 65, it's going to be 71. So we're off six servings. So an error in terms of calculating the number of customers is going to follow through in terms of that acceptability times the number, but it's going to be a relatively small number and not going to affect our finances all that much. One of the ways in which many deal with excess from the patient line goes to the cafeteria, and so some hungry soul in the cafeteria will buy that food item. Okay? Did that make sense, what we're talking about? Okay. The next question that we need to face as we look at production, demand, and staffing level is determining the optimum staffing level. So the first thing that we need to do is to collect data in terms of historical basis. How much labor did we use? It may be in terms of labor hours. How many labor hours were used and how many meals were served? So we're going to look at those two factors and we're going to plot one against the other. And the way that we would do that again, our graph. And so this is going to be labor. No. This is going to be well, come on. It wants to change pages when I do that. So that's labor, and this is meals. And so what we do is actually put the relationship of meals and the number of labor hours on our graph. And so we have a number of points that are on this graph. Then we do a linear regression of the data. So we're going to use that original data that we used to plot, and we're going to calculate the regression line, which is going to be something like that. And so now, this isn't showing on the screen very well, but there is an x-axis there that tells us the number of meals. So if you give me the number of meals, I can tell you the amount of labor that we need by just looking at this relationship, because we're going to read up and we're going to read across to labor and for meals served. This way, what will happen over time is that most of our relationships then are going to be clustered around this line in the future, because we're making a consistent decision, consistent in terms of the number of meals, so that we are not varying an appreciable amount in terms of the amount of labor that we have. In my work at the medical center, before I left, there was a great push, and that push is still there, to make certain that the employees are as productive as possible. And so the word was, when the employees were through work, they went home, whether it was the end of the shift or not. And so in that way, we can come closer to the relationship between meals served and labor actually used. So this is the way in which you could calculate labor requirements given your number of meals that you're going to serve. Now, it works the other way as well. In terms of looking at the overall productivity of the employees, in trying to reduce overtime, for example, if you knew how much labor you had, if you were at maximum strength as far as labor is concerned, and let's say that it's up here, and we go across to the regression line and drop down to the number of meals, that number of meals is the theoretical maximum number of meals that those employees can prepare. And so many times I wish I had this kind of information and enough backbone to stand up to the administrator and say, we cannot do what you want given the number of staff that we have. If you want additional, you're going to have to give us more staff. A good way to justify the need for additional staff to be hired. Questions? Issues? Okay, so we have done that. The next area that we need to talk about briefly is production scheduling. We know the production rate, we know the number of staff that we have, and so now we need to make some decisions in terms of what is it that we're really going to do as far as our menu. And this involves the generation of a production sheet. The production sheet is a way in which we're going to communicate with our cooks exactly what we want, so that they are producing the quality products that we want to have for our customers. And so the production sheet, you can design it any way that you want, but it needs to have certain information on it. Of course, it's going to have the menu item, and that is clear. It's got to also have the recipe that goes with that menu item. I was in a hospital a number of years ago where they did not have recipes. Can you imagine a hospital that does not have recipes? There's a menu, and the menu is a typical menu, but the employees had the opportunity to use the recipes that they wanted rather than a standardized recipe. As a clinical dietitian involved in medical nutrition therapy, would you tolerate that kind of an environment? I don't think so either, because I want to know the nutrient quality of the food that's being served to the patient. And when the employees can do anything that they want, we have no control. It's gone. And so the production sheet then has got to make certain that the appropriate recipe is going along with the menu item. We've got to communicate also how many servings are we going to need. We've just gone through a discussion of how we do that. And so we would put down our estimate of the number of servings that we're going to prepare. When I first started working, we did production planning by counting what the patient had indicated on the menu. There was a machine that counted the marks that were on the menu, and so we would get then a count of the number of servings that were needed for each recipe or for each menu item. It was not successful because there is such a variation in terms of number of patients discharged, patients admitted, and so the count that was done the night before really had no relationship to what was happening the next day. So we were overproducing like crazy. And the reason that we were overproducing was that the cooks, let's stop. The reason we were overproducing was that the person who was doing the analysis of the menus would take the number and then she would pad it just a little bit. She would add more servings just to make sure that we had enough. And then the cooks, when they got the production sheet, they would pad it again. And so we had pad after pad. And so the number that we really needed was much, much less than what was being produced. And so in our forecasting methodology and in our production planning, I think that we need to come as close as possible, to what that real number is, rather than a number that's padded so that it's so deep that when you fall into the mattress, you're going to go down to the bottom. There's no relationship between the forecast and what the actual demand actually is, what it is. It is nice, essential, I think, that we have on the production sheet information regarding how much is prepared, but also how much is left over, or what time did we run out? How many servings could we have used had we had it? So that information is going to be helpful going back to the production planner so that next time we're going to be even more accurate in terms of the amount that we served and prepared and served. So that information is critical. We also need to communicate the time that this menu item is necessary for production. Tray line begins at 11:30, and so the item must be ready and on patient tray line by 11:20 or 11:25 so that it is ready to serve when we begin patient tray line. So there's no excuses. It will be done at 11:20. Maybe there are some excuses, but we'll try not to use too many of them. What cook is going to prepare the menu item? That is going to be assigned on the production sheet as well. And then, are there any special instructions? Sometimes the recipes are very, very critical in terms of the way that the ingredients are combined. And so what we may want to do is to reiterate or to emphasize some of the danger points in the production of the recipe so that the quality is going to be maintained. And then finally, in terms of communication, I recommend a pre-production meeting with the cooks, where that production sheet is used as a basis of communication between the production planner or the supervisor, the head chef, and the various cooks, so that everyone knows what is expected. Is there something that has happened between when the production plan was actually made and this morning that we need to know about? We may need to change that production sheet a little bit in order to be as accurate as possible. Next item that we need to talk about is ingredient control. Ingredient control involves two elements: standardized recipes and ingredient assembly. Are you familiar? Do you use ingredient assembly here at all? Has anyone ever used it? You know what we're talking about? Okay. This is a technique that really has some potential for saving you some money. Ingredient assembly involves the issuing of ingredients to the cooks. What happens is that the recipes go to the ingredient assembly area. And the ingredients that are needed for that recipe are weighed, measured, vegetables are chopped, cheese is grated, the meat is done what needs to be done to that, so that when the cook gets these ingredients, they don't have to go running around the storeroom or running around the kitchen getting what they need, because it's all delivered to them. A surgeon, when they're in the operating theater, do they have to run around and get scalpels and other things that they need? Do they have to run and get sponges? Do they need to? They have someone who is doing that for them. So the surgeon is concentrating exactly on what needs to be done. This was the example that we used when we implemented ingredient assembly in our hospital many, many years ago, which we still continue to do. What has happened as a result of the implementation of that, research that we did showed that the amount of time that cooks spent in running around getting all of these things constituted at the beginning 30% of their time. 30% of the time they were out of the work area, getting things in the storeroom, getting equipment, and so on. With the implementation of the ingredient assembly, where it was all brought to them, that dropped very close to zero. And so our cooks were much more effective. That meant that we did not need as many cooks as we needed, as we currently had. The issue that many of the employees had, because we were implementing a computer system at the same time, they were saying, I'm going to be replaced by a computer. That was rampant throughout the department, and it was throughout the country. People were afraid that they were going to be replaced by a computer. In reality, we had to increase the number of employees, not decrease. So no one was replaced by a computer. But we had too many cooks. And we used normal turnover as a way to adjust our staffing of cooks. So when a cook left, we did not replace, but we adjusted the working pattern so that it would accommodate the work that needed to be done. And so employees that were in other work areas that were able to follow directions and to be able to think on their feet and make good decisions, they were put in the ingredient assembly area. And the last time that I was in the ingredient assembly area was about 2 months ago. And the individual who I was talking with was the ingredient assembly person when I was there 25 years ago. This individual has worked there for almost 40 years. 25 of those 40 years have been in ingredient assembly. And that's something that he really likes. So it's challenging, every day is different, but he is doing some of the basic work that the cook is doing, but at a lower rate of pay. And so that's the way in which money was saved. Labor cost was saved. So ingredient assembly has some other benefits rather than just saving of labor. It is going to contribute to a food and labor cost reduction. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand or to nod yes or no, but I'm going to tell you about me. And I want to see if this strikes you in the same way that it strikes me. If I'm preparing a food item, and I have a recipe and it calls for, let's say, shredded cheese. And so the recipe is calling for 850 grams of shredded cheese. I have a package of 1 kilo of shredded cheese. It's so easy just to put that 1 kilo in. I don't have to deal with the other 150 grams of cheese that is there. Isn't that extra cheese going to make it better? Make the product better? We're not talking about nutrition, we're talking about taste now. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But what has happened in terms of our cost per serving of that recipe? Yes, it's gone up. Because I was careless in terms of the way that I added ingredients. Cooks do this all the time. You need to know that as a clinical dietitian. You really need to assure that the cooks are following the recipe. If you are going to put any assurance that the nutrient analysis is correct, that menu and the recipe have to be followed. Exactly. And so that's one way in which food costs can be saved. Because what happens in ingredient assembly, they will weigh out the 850 grams, and they will put the 150 grams that's extra into the refrigerator so that next time they need it, it is there. And so when that recipe was originally developed, they put in the appropriate amount of cheese. That additional cheese really did not result in improved quality of the product. It just increased calories and fat and cost, among other things. Ingredient assembly also contributes to quality improvement, particularly from the point of view that we use a standardized recipe and we follow that standardized recipe every time that we make it. So consistency is going to contribute to higher quality. That is what is happening in a number of restaurants around the world. They want high quality and they want consistency. And the standardized recipe and ingredient assembly are going to help you to do that. It also limits over and underproduction, because if we're using a standardized recipe, and I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, that is going to assure that we get the consistent number of portions that we need. Not more, not less. So we're communicating to our cooks via the production sheet how much we need. And so they don't have any more ingredients because all the ingredients have been given to them. So they can't artificially increase or decrease the number of servings. It's going to be what was planned and what was actually assembled for their use. So if we were to establish an ingredient assembly in your hospital, the equipment that is necessary is not all that expensive and not that difficult to do. You need a table where you're going to actually do the work. Above the table, I would put a spice rack, because that's one of the things that's going to go into the recipes. I would have a scale so that I could weigh my ingredients rather than having to measure them. I think that you in Europe have a much better system in terms of recipe production, is that you weigh most everything. Is that true? Our European relatives, I mean, that's what they do in Denmark, is everything is weighed. And I think that is a far better way than the measuring that we do in terms of the number of cups or the number of whatever, because there's so much variability. So, but there are some times that we're going to need measuring spoons and cups. We're going to need a refrigerator to put those leftover grams of cheese that we were talking about so that they're available next time we need it. Some food processors, things that we can use to chop, to grate, to do whatever form of the food is necessary in preparation for it to go to the cooks. So the cooks don't do that. And then we need some food trolleys, some carts that are going to actually take the food to the cooks. And so that would be taken to the cooks at the appropriate scheduled time so that they have enough time to finish the product and get the product to a tray line by 11:20. So that's what we need. And then you need to have a skilled employee who has a good sense of what is necessary to do to prepare food and ready for final preparation. So we've already talked about this, the research on ingredient assembly, and indicating that about 30% of the cook's time prior to ingredient assembly was spent just running around. Remember 2 days ago, I think we were talking about waste, and one of the wastes was transportation. Well, I think that is very definitely true, because in research that we were doing at Loma Linda, we found that cooks, particularly, when they were transporting with a trolley or with a cart, they were spending more than half of their time that was spent in movement, transportation, just pushing an empty cart. Not productive. A cart is essential to get food and supplies from one place to another, but pushing an empty cart does not necessarily contribute to increased productivity. This is a good time to stop for a break, I think. It's been an hour or so since we started on this, and it's a good transition point. And so we'll take about a 10-minute break and come back at about 25 minutes till 6. Okay, so we have been looking at 2 ways in which we can control ingredients. And the second way now is through recipes, particularly standardized recipes. Now, I think you all know a recipe. You've used those. And I had an assignment for you to bring a recipe today. Did you bring your recipe? Good.
No.
Oh, dear. Anyone? We'll spend some time looking at that anyway. We'll think of recipes that are in our head, okay? Have you ever prepared food without a recipe? Do you have the freedom to experiment with combining foods?
The 10 years of experience.
Do you really need to have experience in order to just play around with ingredients? That's one thing I always try to tell students, is to feel free to play with ingredients. But when you find that perfect recipe, you've got to know what you did before you got there so you can do it again. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to play. And so in terms of a recipe, I think we need to have that. But specifically in terms of recipes when we're dealing with sick people, where we're needing to know the nutrient analysis, we've got to have consistency. I don't think there's any way that we can get around it. And so, first of all, there are different styles of recipes. And I do have some of them, but the first one is an action form. And that's the typical recipe that you see that homemakers use. List of ingredients and then instructions at the bottom as to what needs to happen. Do you like that style of recipe? I don't. I have been surprised too many times when I start out at the top. I know what to do because I didn't read the instructions. So I start out on this and I drain this product and mix it all up. And then I get down to the bottom and it says, take what you drained off that can, in the first step and do this with it. Well, it's all gone. So what do I do? And so I think that another better format is the block format. And so it will start out with the ingredients. And so if you have sugar and fat that you need to cream, so it's going to put those two ingredients together and then what you do with them is just to the left. Many institutional recipes are of this format. This is the format that I really encourage you to use. And so then you get to the next ingredients and what you do with that and how those are combined. So at the end, you have followed the recipe precisely and haven't thrown away ingredient stuff that you've needed. I deal with that with students quite often because they don't sit down and read the recipe. And that's the first step in preparing something, is you've got to sit down and read it. But a little bit more about that in a moment. There's a third style, and I don't know if you have seen it here, but it is a descriptive form, and it's not very specific. And I say it's historical in that this is the way that recipes were passed on from mother to daughter and on. And it's just a paragraph. It will say, take butter the size of a hen's egg and do this with it and so on. It's not very precise, but it gets the point across as to what is to be done. I don't encourage that one at all because it's, by the time you get through all of that paragraph, you forgot what you needed to do up above. But I have a book that was published, a recipe book that was published in the late 1700s, second cookbook that was published in the United States. And all the recipes are of that form. So that's why I say it's historical. But it's fun, just as diversionary reading, to look at some of the old recipes. So when we have a recipe, it's not good enough just to have the ingredients and what to do with it. There are some other factors that we need to include in that if we're going to have a good recipe for quantity food production. And that is, we've got to have the name. And if I could get this across to my students, we need to know how many servings that recipe will yield. Too often they will take a recipe that it will say serve 6 to 8. Well, is it 6 or is it 7 or is it 8? What's the serving size? I don't know. And certainly the people who are making it don't have any idea. And if we want to be clear in terms of how that recipe is going to be used and how many servings we're going to get from it, we need to have that information. So we need to go through a recipe standardization process. And we're preparing for that right now. So by knowing what the total yield is, we need to know the number of portions and the portion size. What is an appropriate portion size? Well, I think that's going to depend upon the nutritional values that we want from that product. Now, if you're interested, let's say, in calcium, and this serving will meet 25% of the calcium need for the day. That's pretty high amount of calcium in one product, I think. No? Anyway, are we going to want to try to get all the calcium that we need in this one menu item? Oh, I hope not, because we'd have so much that we need to eat. So we need to look at a balance between the amount that can really be consumed and the amount of nutrition that we get from the product. I think that your standard is like 100 grams or 200 grams or 300 grams portion size, depending on the food product.
Our size are bigger than yours, I don't know.
Depending on the density of the product and so on. Okay. We also need to know about the cooking time and the cooking temperature. We need to know that before we start preparing the food. Again, students will start making a recipe and then it says put it in the oven at 180 degrees. Well, the oven wasn't turned on in time, and so the product has to sit out and wait until the oven gets to the appropriate temperature. The recipe needs to have the ingredients in the order in which they are used, not mixed up. And it needs to know the amount of each ingredient. Then what we do with each of those in terms of procedures, panning and portioning information. This is, I think, is quite critical. you're going to have pie. Pie comes in a pie pan, and you cut it 8 portions per pie, 10, 12, 3, something. And so you forecast that you need 73 servings of pie. Now, we have 8 servings in a pan, so 73 divided by 8 is going to be 9. 8 times 9 is 72, and we have 1 serving left over. So what we're going to do is put enough ingredients in those 9 pie pans, and then we're going to put the other 1 ingredient in the pie pan. What's that product going to come out looking like when it comes out of the oven? You have to forecast in the number of portions that you can get in a pan. So a half a pie put into a full pie pan just isn't going to work. And I've had students who try to do that. It just doesn't work. So if you're dealing with a meatloaf and it's going into a pan, and you have half the amount that needs to go in that pan, you're going to end up with a meatloaf that's about that high. And so it's going to cook faster, it's going to get tough, and it's going to be unacceptable. The quality has gone down the drain. So we need to look at the amount of product that we can get into a pan and then forecast in increments of that number of servings that would go into the pan. Some garnishing suggestions would also be nice, but these need to be included in the list of ingredients so that, you know, you're looking for a garnish and there's some suggestions, but you didn't see that until later, and so you don't have that on hand. So you've got to have that in terms of your ingredients necessary. HACCP food guidelines as far as food safety. That is important on a recipe. And then you may include the nutrient analysis from that recipe as well. But the bottom line is no surprises. Do your very best to assure that in the recipes that you're using that there are no surprises. And so the way in which we can do that is to do recipe standardization. And this is a process where we're tailoring a recipe so that it can be consistent in terms of the way that it tastes, the way that it looks. And the standardization is specifically for that institution, that food service. I cannot give you a standardized recipe from our hospital for your hospital because the ingredients are different, the methodology may be different, the expectations may be different. And so what you need to do then is to go through a process of re-standardization of that recipe so that it meets your needs rather than what our needs and what our objectives were. So I think that we've talked enough about why we're going to standardize a recipe. But let's look at the... do we want to talk about that? Yes, we probably need to talk about it. Why are we forecasting uniform quality, uniform quantity? The standardized recipe increases the productivity of the cooks because they are using the same process, and so they know how to prepare it. A problem that we had when we implemented the ingredient room was the cooks did not use the recipe. Do you know where the recipe was in the for the cooks? Right up there. And so they would follow what they were used to. They would never follow our recipes at all. And so if we needed to make a change, there was no way that we could go in and reprogram that cook. We had to really sit down with the cook and say, you need to follow the recipe from a disciplinary point of view to that extent. But if they are following the recipe, they can become much more productive. It also increases managerial effectiveness in terms of We are certain in terms of the amount of food needing to be purchased, the amount used, so that we have consistency in terms of money, our budget. And it controls overproduction, particularly from the point of view that if we know that this recipe prepares 100 servings, we don't need to pad, we don't need to do anything. If we know that we need 100 servings, we're going to get 100 servings out of that recipe. Or we can expand or reduce that recipe by a factor to get to 150 servings or 173 servings or whatever it is that we need. But I think fundamentally it helps to train the employee cook so that they are well trained. But the overwhelming reason for a standardized recipe in my mind is the consistent nutrient content per serving. So if you're going to be involved in knowing what the nutrient analysis is, you need a standardized recipe. So the process that we use in standardizing a recipe is a fairly easy but complex method. Is that opposite, easy but complex? Precise may be a better word. Okay? This is where I wanted you to use a recipe. I wanted you to read a recipe and go through the process of desk checking a recipe. Have you ever done that? When I look at a recipe book, what am I looking at? The pictures.
No.
The words? Yeah, in a book, yeah. So I have a recipe book that has, I buy recipe books because of the pictures. And so I look at the pictures and then I'll go and look at the recipe. But I often will desk check by the picture rather than actually reading the recipe. But it is so important that we read the recipe from the very beginning to the very end. Because what we're doing in desk checking is looking at the suitability of that menu item for quantity food production. So it may be a home-size recipe that we're starting with, and we want a recipe at the conclusion that's going to serve at least 100. And in doing so, we've got to make certain that we know what that recipe is to begin with, and so we read it. Are the proportions of the ingredients anywhere near what they should be? Or are they completely skewed? And as you increase that recipe, are the amount of spices and herbs in there going to become overwhelming to the product? I have seen that so often. We have had students who will take a home-size recipe and try to make 150 servings out of it. And as they factor the recipe so that it will make 150 servings, in one instance they came up with a requirement that they needed 180 pounds of cheese. That's more than a pound of cheese per customer, per serving. Is that anywhere near correct? I don't think so. But that's why you need to read and reread the recipe to make certain that it is giving you the information that you really need. So, you make the recipe exactly as it is written. No variation at all. And in doing so, you note any lack of information or any procedures that are wrong or not clear to you. Make note of that so that you can deal with that the next time you make the recipe. Evaluate the recipe for acceptability after you have prepared it. Does the recipe have the potential for further expansion? So there are recipes that as you increase them, the volume and the weight of the ingredients are such that it's very easy to overmix. And so there are some things, let me give some examples here. Do you know cream puffs? It's just essentially a flour and egg and milk combination, and you make a small piece of that, and as you put it in the oven, the moisture in that puffs it up, and so then you fill it with whipped cream. Okay? So if you take a home-size recipe of that and try to make it automatically to 100, you're going to have so much mixing that is going to go on that the gluten is developed, and so it's going to be tough and not as tender as what you want if you're only making 4 of them. So there are some recipes that just are not appropriate for increasing. We'll have them as small things at home rather than in our quantity kitchen. And so you keep doubling the recipe. So I would make the recipe as it's written and then double it if everything is passed, if it's a good recipe. So next time I make it, I would double it. And then I would evaluate the number of servings that I got from it, the serving size. And then based upon that, using a factor, then I would bring it up to as close to 50 as I could, and then double that, and then we would be at 100 servings for that recipe. But every time I would make that recipe, I would serve it to a focus group or to a test panel so that they are giving me feedback as far as the acceptability of that recipe. And so I'm continually evaluating. As we get to 100, one of the things that I'm going to be interested in knowing about is what are the handling or the cooking losses that happen. What would be an example of a handling loss in the preparation of a recipe? Any idea? What about that? If you're making cookies, for example, and you have cookie dough in the bowl that you have mixed the cookies in, you can't get 100% of that cookie dough out. So the part that is left is a loss. So your yield is going to be less than 100%. So that's what we're talking about in terms of a handling loss. But we also have cooking losses. So if you put 20 grams of cookie dough on a baking sheet and put it in the oven, how much is that cookie dough going to weigh when it comes out of the oven? It's going to weigh less because moisture has been driven off, and so it's going to not have the same weight. And often for nutrient analysis, we've got to account for that cooking loss, because are we going to use the ingredient weights of the dough? Are we going to use the cookie weight in calculating nutrient analysis? It makes a difference. And so we've got to be aware of the effect that cooking, mixing, production losses as they occur. This next one is one that was not in the book, but it's one that I put in. And I think it's important to evaluate the amount of individual handwork that's required for producing that recipe. Does the recipe have the potential for quantity food production? Does the larger volume of ingredients mix well? Does it result in overmixing that we were talking about? Or it just completely destroys the mix and you don't have any quality left? So you've got to evaluate that, and I think that's critical too. Once you have come what you think is the end of the recipe standardization process, I think there's one more thing that we need to do. And that is, you or I are the one who have been making this recipe time and time again. Give it to a colleague. give the recipe to a colleague. Have them make it. Did it turn out the same? Were there some things that you were keeping in your mind that you did not put on the recipe? And so if the quality of the product that is made by a colleague is the same as what you have been experiencing, I would say that recipe is standardized. And so it's going to give us consistent quality and quantity as we prepare it over the years that we use. Okay. I wanted to do some professional practice. So maybe we'll have to do this at home. Look at a recipe in terms of what we have just learned. The things that we have looked at, the list that I have given to you, are the things that we need to look at as we originally desk check that recipe. What amount of work is it? Is it going to be easy, or is it going to just take a lot of work, particularly handwork? Meatballs and cookies and things like that that you have to portion out and make certain that they're the same size. That's going to take a lot of time. Is there another way in which you can make a similar product? And you've got to then answer the question for yourself, to your satisfaction. And that is, does this recipe have the potential for being an effective member of your recipe family so that it is going to be acceptable to your customer? The first time I serve this recipe to the patients or to the customers in the cafeteria, what I would do is that I would do several things. I would give samples, let them taste it, see if they buy it. Is the taste enough to give them the incentive to buy it? But then I would also look at what is coming back, plate waste. Are they eating the product once they have taken it? Is there enough quality in it saying that they would want to do it, they would want to purchase it again? And I think that's important, and that's often overlooked as part of this recipe standardization process. Because what I'm really after is a quality product that's going to bring additional finances into your organization. Because that's what we really want. We want new and innovative ideas that we can bring, and that's one of the things about looking at recipe books and food magazines, things that you see on television as far as food and food items, things that are going to bring excitement to your operation. That's what we're interested in. We can talk about that, or we can do it tomorrow. I'm of an opinion that I would like to send the students home, and I would like them to desk check a recipe. Okay? I'd like for you to choose particularly recipes that you have regularly used for some time, recipes that you are really familiar with, and to look at the recipe again for the first time. Does that make any sense? Looking at it again for the first time with the knowledge that you have just gotten in terms of what we want to look for in that recipe. And the basic question that I want you to answer is, does this recipe have the potential for being part of a set of recipes for quantity food production? Is it going to be acceptable to a wide audience, or is it going to be a very specialized group that would eat that product? Also, this is a time for you to work on your menu. How are you coming on the menu? Anything being done yet? As the end is coming. The other thing that I would like to talk about as we close Yesterday, as we closed, I asked you a question in terms of what we did yesterday. What is there that we can use to measure quality? I think we began the day and ended the day with that question. I'd like to end today with that same question. In terms of quality, what sentences can we write that are going to tell us whether or not we have quality in what we're doing? An example would be our standardized recipes used in production. Yes or no? That's going to tell me about the quality level of that operation. And so as we develop this list of quality standards, we're going to be able to evaluate the level of quality that is in that facility. So I am expecting that at the end of our time together that I will get a list of quality standards that can be answered yes or no, that are going to be based upon the things that we have done each of the days. And so as we look at what has happened today, I gave you an example of a standardized recipe. Is there another area that we've talked about that we could use to measure quality in terms of a standard? We talked about, what did we talk about today? We talked about, I'm sorry?
Forecasting.
Forecasting, yeah, okay. So in terms of forecasting, what kind of a question would you ask?
How the weather can influence our forecast?
Okay.
We are too sleepy like today because the pressure was low outside.
Even a simple question like, is a forecast model used in forecasting? Yes or no? And what I'm really after in that is consistency. Is there a consistency in terms of the way in which we are trying to determine what our production demand is going to be? So, sometime when we don't have anything else to do, I'll talk about my doctoral research. That will put you to sleep for sure. But it has to do with this whole thing that we've been talking about today. Production demand, staffing, in order to minimize cost. And the bottom line of that is consistency. Consistency in the way in which we make decisions, consistency in the way in which we do our work. That is going to end up, in my opinion, saving us money. The bottom line on my research was that by providing consistency, there was a 14% savings in labor, in terms of labor hours. And so as the cost of labor increases, that cost savings is going to increase above the 14%. So I don't think a 14% savings would be turned down by many people. I think they would accept that. So, and the only difference was consistency in the decision-making process. Good. Have a wonderful evening. So we'll see you tomorrow afternoon, and what we're going to do tomorrow afternoon is to finish talking now about yield. We talked about cooking yields for just a moment, but we're going to get deeply involved in cooking yields and edible portion yields and as-purchase yields that are going to be helpful not only in cost analysis, but in nutritional analysis. Very, very critical.